My sermon this morning is Tikkan Olam, healing the world, restoring the self. And it's a kind of follow-up to a sermon I gave here a month ago or so that was Atonement Without Sin, Unitarian Universalist Perspectives on Yom Kippur. One of the things that really interested me in that theme of atonement that I spoke to last time, at one with ourselves, at one with God, at one with others, that as Jews move into the new year at that high, holy point of contemplation and reconciliation, that an innocence is restored, that the point and focus of that is to completely focus ourselves on that part of us that is the intrinsic worth that we Unitarian Universalists set as our first principle. That self that no matter what we do and how we fail is never itself tainted by that. That self that can never fall from grace. That was one of the things that most interested me in my remarks last month, how that innocence is restored through that self. I also recall that in my own failings, it has a lot less, what I have to atone for has a lot less to do with what I've done and a lot more to do with what I've left undone. And in a way, I was reflecting in my own life on how I could be more responsive to my world, responsive to those who are important parts of my life. In a way, that sense of responsibility in my own individual case is also a matter of being responsive to my ability, being able to bring, in a fuller sense, my gifts out into the world. So in that sense today, what I want to do is I want to take that notion of a responsibility year-round, a responsibility to recover from myself my deepest gifts and bring that to the world. And I want to do that in terms of this principle of Tikkan Olam, which is, I think, very much on the plane of the remarks that I was addressing last time. In fact, the reason you're getting this sermon today is because I ran out of time when I was giving my last one to get to this part of the sermon. Hence, we could call it Part B. But don't worry, if you miss Part A, you'll just ride right along with me. We would be one. On one level, when we think of repairing the world, when we think of a phrase that would indicate a responsibility for human beings to take initiatives with each other in society and for the good of all, we think of that as good works. We can think of it at the level of good deeds, of behaviors of a certain type. At another level, however, at a deeper level, I think, it's a matter of our being in a broken world. Sometimes as I hear the concerns that are expressed, as I reflect on the broader world, even in this age of an America that's becoming greater than ever, I can still somehow feel that my world is broken. I can somehow feel like I'm living a bit of an impaired life in an impaired world where nothing's quite getting through in the shining, clear, we would be one sense of spirit that seems more true and natural to who I feel myself and us to be. And so in that sense, my relationship with the world, my being in the world, it's at that deeper level that I want to focus on the things we do to make our worlds better. And I'm especially interested in how this can be our covenant. When we speak in that covenant of the difference we make in our lives and in the world around us. Sometimes we might think, oh, in our lives, that's spirituality. In our world around us, that's social justice. And as Unitarian Universalists, for those of you who have been with this ride for a little while, you may well be aware that there's this push-me-pull-you thing within Unitarian Universalism, within our tradition, where there are some persons who have a very secular bearing on what values need to be understood as, and who in some cases recoil against others who would see those couched in spiritual terms. So for instance, if I were to say the word God too many times, some of you would gag allergically. Others of you would say, oh, I'm so glad someone's finally acknowledging. So within the we that we are, these are some of the things that have inflected our celebration of plurality and difference within Unitarian Universalism. So what I want to do today as we speak to Tikkan Olam is I want to find in that Jewish tradition a linkage between spirituality and what we would call social action in many cases, or social justice work, that we as Unitarian Universalists can be inspired by, even down to the level of our little old All Souls covenant. So I hope I can deliver on some of that promise. That sounds pretty good. Sounded interesting to me in any case. I'll drink to that one. So the Hebrew phrase Tikkan Olam, Tikkun Olam is how that's usually transliterated, to fix the world. This theme is as old as Judaism, but the phrase has an incredibly short history in terms of that scale of time. Actually, this has been an important term in this usage for about my lifetime, which is like a millisecond in Jewish history. The earliest use of the term was in fact quite different from the way it's used today, back somewhere between the 2nd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. It had a rabbinical, almost legalistic application, primarily in terms of guarding the established order, making things right, fixing loopholes so that the established order could be applied in an appropriate way in the world. Then this is reflected a bit in the 14th century Alain, where it is God that is called to sweep away idolatry and to fix the world. So the phrase Tikkan, or at least some variant of that, appears in that prayer as invoking God to fix the world. So our role is to pray to God to do it, right? That sounds pretty orthodox. I think most people who, anyway, that's the Orthodox way. But then came Kabbalah. Some of you may have gotten some familiarity with the Kabbalistic tradition within Judaism. Most traditions in world religions have both an exoteric, outward, popular way of practicing and some kind of inner esoteric tradition, whether that is Christian mysticism or the Sufis of Islam. One of the most important of those traditions in Judaism is the Kabbalah, which goes back, actually, one of the prime sources for that is the Zohar of around 1275 of the Common Era, which was a mystical novel that took as its character, as the sort of context for it, is that God is infinite and in God's own essence, unknowable, unnameable. It is the sky god, as Karen Armstrong characterizes it anthropologically, the one that's kind of hard to worship because so inaccessible, so untouching of our lives. But this sky god, this unknowable God, becomes manifest through a creation story. And I want to share just a little bit of that so that you can contrast this way of understanding creation from the 7-day version that we find in Genesis, whether we take that as a book of the Torah or of the culturally appropriated Old Testament. So while my pages are sticking together, you'll recall the whole on the 7th day he rested thing. So contrast that with this. In the beginning, when the will of the king began to take effect, the engraved signs into the divine aura, a dark flame sprang forth from the innermost recesses of Ein Sof, that is, God itself, like a fog which forms out of the formless. Enclosed in the ring of this aura, neither white nor black, red nor green, of no color whatsoever. But when this flame began to assume size and extension, it produced radiant colors. For in the inmost center a well sprang forth from which flames poured upon everything below, hidden in the mysterious secrets of Ein Sof. The well broke through, and yet did not entirely break through, the eternal aura which surrounded it. And so we have a dynamic drama of a kind of formation out of nothingness that retains, in some sense, that nothingness. One of the ways that we can sort of understand this, though it's mystical and very metaphysical, is imagine that in the beginning there was only God. How did anything other than God come to be? Well, that's a question that fascinates cosmologists even today in science, doesn't it? Fascinates me. Imagine, from a God point of view, as opposed to what we would call a scientific one, that God empties out a part of God to create a space within which something non-God can manifest so that it can reflect back God to God in an act of self-awareness on God's part. In other words, what if the very act of creation is God alienating part of God and going into exile in order that there can be a created world? Or vice versa. That's, well, I'll let you think on that, but not too long. One of the things that fell out of this is that in addition to the sky god, who is that original sort of thing, the dark flame basically penetrates and impregnates the womb of the eternal mother. And so this feminine figure of the divine that Jung would call the anima and says an essential part of the balancing of our spirituality at individual and collective levels. The female aspect of God, Shekinah, is now alienated from God, exiled, and wandering in the world. This story had really strong appeal to Sephardic Jews who were exiled from Spain. In 1492, Spain exiled Sephardic Jews. I think that's the saying we learned in school, right? I think I have the year right. But it also, for European Ashkenazim as well, had a real appeal to peoples who have always been persecuted and had never at that point really had a stable home. The next chapter in that historical story is in the 16th century of the Common Era, Isaac Luria, whose creation story was even more dramatic. When we go back to thinking about God in God's self, the Godhead, if you will, withdrawing in that way the creation was accomplished is that there were vessels to contain the attributes of God. And we could think of these vessels, I'm told, like slightly thicker bodies of light that were husks for the divine attributes. So if there's so many different, there's God as God, and then we're going to split off certain attributes, but to split them off, they need to be contained in something. There was a problem, Houston. The problem was that there was so much divine energy in that it broke the husks. Those containers could not handle God's energy, and they broke. So what happened to the divine light? It went all over the place. It scattered, and some of it fell. So now what we have in Lurian Kabbalah is we have a story about God being exiled and scattered into the world, and then there we are as human beings in this world that God was creating, but something went wrong. So here's one account of it that we can draw from rabbinic teachings. The divine plan A was to create humanity so that we could help redeem those lost sparks. But again, the best laid plans of gods and whomevers, what should go wrong except some proverbial serpent coming along, and Eve and Adam, and so we have the fall of man. So we can't just rely on a perfected human being as the image of God to be the helpmate for God doing this. So plan B was that God entered into a covenant with the nation of Israel for Israel to be the divine helpmate in the human role that was to have been Adam's and Eve's, but that now under divine plan B, subsection 3a, is to fall to the nation of Israel. Very, very interesting way to understand the place of a people in history and to reconcile that and embed it within this mystical, metaphysical stuff that so fascinates me. And so, what the Jew is called to do as a Jew is to live out her being in the world in the image of God. Because all of us are created in the image of God, and as images of God, we embody what God needs in this broken world. Isn't that cool? I think that's way cool. Anyway, and so even if this is a newer use of the phrase Tikkan Olam to refer to acts of social justice and that sort of thing, the whole history of Judaism is a history that's inspired by the statements, do justice and acts of kindness, inspired by the tradition of Chesed. What we would call perhaps secular acts of goodness, of justice, have always been grounded in spiritual truth for observant Jews and for secular Jews alike. The rabbis, the Jews did not always believe in an afterlife, and some still don't. If we look back historically, anthropologists of religion tell us that in the earliest days of the writings that were incorporated into the Torah, that the thought behind those was that the only means of immortality are through your lineage, or through a people, or through memorialized deeds, that there is no personal soul that would survive death or be recreated. The kind of first level theory of an afterlife that seemed to be behind those writings was that it wasn't Plato, it wasn't a soul that lives on, it was you die, you're nothing. But then Yahweh, God, recreates you just as you were created initially. So it's interesting and important that the afterlife, what we might for those of us who, as you use, kind of rebel against the spiritual, afterlife thinking, spook stuff is what some react negatively to. But you have to understand Jewish tradition, as I read it anyway, as not being dependent on the soul version of a spook in that sense. That it goes back to a tradition of community and covenant and acts that are grounded very differently. In fact, I found it fascinating to read that the rabbis admitted that we live in a world where the righteous suffer and the wicked thrive too often. Therefore, a little bit later, after Plato, into the medieval era for us, perhaps, therefore, the afterlife is required in order to reconcile the world with divine justice. Because there is no revising the Torah. And the Torah says God is just. So God must be just because the Torah says so. But how could God be just if the world works like this? Answer, there's more to it than meets the eye. There must be, because the Torah don't lie. Okay? All right. So what we call evil or sin would then not just be something that happens, it would be part of who we are. And you know why it's part of who we are? Because God gave us the inclination and the temptation to, let's say, stray because we're free beings. And if we had no inclination to do anything other than what God Daddy wanted us to do or God Mommy wanted us to do, that freedom wouldn't mean anything if there were nothing countering it. So again, viewed this way, there's this really kind of interesting complexity that's built into us, and perhaps by these interpretations, even in God herself. Now, let's zoom out from the details of history and concepts to the bigger picture of our lives in today's world. How can we relate these themes of creation and exile to our sense of human purpose? I was reminded when they were describing the formlessness of creation in the Zohar of something I saw in the Washington Post just a few days ago, although it might be a slightly older article, about the first picture scientists have taken of a black hole. And in explaining how they did it and what was involved, one of the things they referred to is our expanding universe and the Hubble shift and the interesting fact that different calculations of this measure of the speed of the expansion of the universe don't exactly agree. But there was a little caveat in there that I needed. It said it's important for people to recall it's not that galaxies are moving away from each other in space. That's not it. Space itself is expanding, inflating. So it's kind of like if you took a balloon that had almost no air in it, you're pinching it with your fingers and you mark some galaxies on that, and then you inflate it a bunch, they're going to be farther apart. But not because they moved, the space of the balloon got bigger. So I'd like to use that as a metaphor, not just for the cosmic dimensions of our physical world, but for a kind of cosmic appraisal of our social world. As our human civilizations have grown and have speeded up in the rate of development, haven't we too gotten farther from each other? Haven't we too become more separated, more distant, not because we're trying to move away from anybody, but because the rate of social change blows up our world like that balloon to distances we can't always cross with each other. So I may not know who you are, you may not know who I am, we may not see each other clearly, as the song puts it. So when I think of it in that way, and I begin, instead of beginning from the Torah, instead of beginning from history, if I begin from the way many people think in this expanded balloon of social disintegration, I might think like a libertarian. I might begin not as Jews do, from a community in covenant with God. I might begin from the individual. I might, in fact, believe that there are fundamentally contracting individuals who enter into relationships with each other, and that's what's primary. In fact, that's the Enlightenment ideal of individualism, right? That's where we get democracy. It's where we get Adam Smith's model of capitalism. And if I think like a capitalist, I used to teach business ethics. If you can imagine me teaching business ethics and trying to keep my politics out of it, like, good luck with that. I did my best. But one of the things that I recall very vividly is the line of argument that the social responsibility of a business is to maximize the profits of its shareholders. And so if we can put some extra lead in that paint to kill the kids off, but it makes money for us, if we can put an exploding engine in a Ford Pinto, whatever, as long as our profits go up. How could anyone think like that? I don't want to go there. Where I do want to go is this. We can ask a question today that is meaningful today that I think would not have been meaningful to the Jews of any of these eras. And that is, why do good works? What's in it for me? What's the motive? Why should I do good works, right? So one of the ways that we can understand that question is that it comes from a place that's already wrong. I'm beginning from an isolated individual who's part of a broken world, and only in that context would the question come up. One way of thinking about that is that the theories that have been generated about human being that justify that kind of individualism are ideology. They're in the service of the, Marx would say, in the interests of what does he call it? Proletariats are the bourgeois. It's a bourgeois ideology. I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I thought like a good Marxist. Even a bad one, I think. But more interestingly to me, we can also think of it as idolatry. What does the capitalist worship? Money, economic value, capital, profit, right? Idolatry is the worship of the products of human labor. If I were going to put it in the terms of political economics. Idolatry is not only the worship of images of things that look like gods, it's treating like God things that are only things, right? So if the Orthodox traditional view in Judaism of Tikkan Olam is to overcome idolatry, doesn't it make sense that in today's world, people who understand the dynamics of social justice would say, if we're going to overcome idolatry, there's some stories going around that need to be overturned. And some of those stories show up on news channels. Some of those stories show up in transcripts of recordings done in the highest levels of our trusted leaderships. So there are any number of ways that we could find that challenging idolatry could become a social activism, and not only an orthodox call to worship the God in which we are with covenant. So, one way of answering the question, why do good works, is to ground that in an answer that calls to spirituality. You should do good works because you have not understood who you are or who we are. If that's the way you think, that it's all about me, me, me. You are a victim of idolatry. And you didn't even make it up. You're somebody else's dupe going along with that. So why do good acts? Because that helps liberate you to think for yourself and to be a person in community who is not under the yoke of idolatry. But another way to think about that question is not to think of the answer as breaking with idolatry, but to think of spirituality as something besides a ground, something besides a foundation. In other words, we're going to still answer perhaps in terms of a spiritual response, but we're not going to say it's God's will or you are in the image of God. We might say instead, spirituality need not be a function of any God, any creed, any metaphysics. I can call spiritual anything in my life that opens me to a dimension of being in my world that touches the part of me that has intrinsic value and that in that value is intrinsically connected with the value of all that is. The part of me that is of the earth, the part of me that is of the community, the part of me that can be one with music. These are my spiritualities, even if I never pick up a religion or philosophy book. Even if, in some imagined context, I've never even heard of religion. It can still be a matter of spirituality. So we might say, when we think of the relationship between doing good works, as in social action type stuff, and spirituality in terms of that vertical dimension of relationship with the broader being, which may even be described as God. I can do that without God. I could do it with God. The point is, it is in either case a response and a way of overcoming the idolatry that seizes so much of our thinking in today's world. I want, in that context, to go back to that core of the untainted self that Luria speaks of and that we celebrate in our first principle. Luria said that if one wants to practice Kabbalah and wants to help fix the world, he says the first thing a person needs to do is to attain peace of mind. So, in attaining peace of mind, we can't take that as a given. So I want to, as a link to my last remarks today, I want to recall again something I've shared with you before that's in the real cutting edge right now psychology literature. And that is that there's a lot of thinking that we are not what Freud called egos. There's more than one being going on that I would have to call myself. I am legion. I got lots of parts to me. And actually, one of the movements that I've been really interested in, I found someone who can help me play with this a little bit in Jacksonville, is internal family systems therapy. And so just as in a family, when you do therapy, you want the parts to get along. If I am legion, I want the parts of myself to be in harmony. I want my true self to be the conductor of those parts in a greater harmony. So in summary, there are parts that are exiles. There are parts that are sad, hurt, fearful. There are parts that are managers. There may be a tug-of-war between the perfectionist and the foot dragger for the gaming console of myself, as in the movie Inside Out, if any of you have seen that. There are flamethrowers, which might be raging or they might be addictions. But again, through that way of looking at things, part of the process of me being in a position to help fix the world is for me, in some sense, to fix myself, to be at peace with myself, to have my own house in order, if I could put it that way. So viewed in that way, the observation that we should attain a harmony and a peace of mind in ourselves makes a lot of sense psychologically and socially as well. But if one way to answer the question, why should I do good things, is to say because it's grounded in a whole relationship with God. If a second way is to say, it doesn't have to be grounded that way, but the spirituality that you experience in your life is liberating. Another approach to this is to say, let's not ground it in the individual at all. Let's say, I appreciate what you're saying, Isaac, but we're going to set you aside. We're going to put this thing about get your own house in order, find peace of mind, we're going to set that aside. Perhaps instead of beginning from the individual self in this age that begins too often from there, let's do this instead. Will you close your eyes with me for a minute? Actually, I'm going to leave mine open so I can read what I got in front of me, but you close yours if you don't mind. Close your eyes, see yourself, visualize yourself for a moment, and zoom out from there. See this group of all souls together, here, now. Yourself, very much part of that group. Zoom farther out to where you no longer see individuals, though of course it's ourself that we're still seeing. See this oasis of life energy, this spirit of life filling this place, here, now. Open your eyes and say with me our covenant of all souls. We are Unitarian Universalists. We welcome all souls as we meet on spiritual common ground to build our shared vision. We do this work for the difference it will make in our lives and in the world around us. Namaste.